I watched her perfectly manicured hands shake with excitement as she signed the final document. The ink wasn't even dry on the contract that officially handed over my late father's multi-million-dollar company, his entire life's work, directly to her. My stepmother, Susan, looked across the mahogany boardroom table and shot me a sickening, triumphant smirk that practically screamed, "I won, and you get nothing." She thought she had just robbed me of my birthright. She thought she had just secured a lifetime of yachts, designer bags, and unchecked luxury at my expense. And me? I just smiled back. Because what Susan didn't know was that she hadn't just stolen a fortune. She had just signed her own financial death warrant. I was about to watch the woman who destroyed my mother and manipulated my father lose absolutely everything. But to understand how I handed my greatest enemy the rope to hang her own lavish lifestyle, we have to go back 3 years, to the day the nightmare started. 3 years ago, my life was actually perfectly normal. My father was a titan in our city. He built a regional manufacturing empire from the ground up, standing side by side with the real brains behind the operation. My mother. They were a team. They built a legacy that was supposed to last generations. But legacies are fragile things. When I was 24, my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was brutal. It was fast, and it shattered our world. My father, this stoic, untouchable businessman, completely fell apart. He stopped going to the office. He stopped eating. When my mom passed, a massive part of him died with her. Enter Susan. Susan was a 34-year-old lifestyle influencer with a maxed-out credit score, a closet full of fake designer bags, and a predatory instinct sharper than a great white shark. She met my dad at a charity gala just 6 months after my mother's funeral. He was vulnerable, lonely, and drowning in grief. She was young, beautiful, and willing to play the doting savior. Within 3 months, she had moved into his 6-bedroom estate. Within 6 months, there was a diamond the size of a marble on her finger. I tried to warn him. I begged him to see what was right in front of his face. But Susan was a master manipulator. She played the victim perfectly, crying to my dad that I was just a jealous, grieving daughter who couldn't handle seeing him happy. She slowly, methodically isolated him. She fired the housekeeper who had been with us for 20 years. She changed the locks for security. She even started answering his personal cell phone. I was being entirely boxed out of my own family. And then, my father got sick. It started as minor memory lapses, but it escalated into a severe stroke that left him bedridden. Suddenly, Susan wasn't just his young wife, she was his absolute gatekeeper. She had full medical power of attorney, and she used it like a weapon. She restricted my visiting hours to 30 minutes a week, always with her in the room, hovering like a vulture waiting for its meal. But Susan made one massive, fatal mistake. She underestimated me. She thought because I was young and grieving, I was stupid. She thought I didn't know the entry code to my father's private home office, the one room she was too bored to ever snoop through. One afternoon, while Susan was out getting her 3rd chemical peel of the month, I slipped into the house. I bypassed the alarm, went straight into his mahogany-paneled study, and opened his floor safe. I was looking for his medical directives. I wanted to find a way to legally challenge her control over his health care. But what I found instead made my blood run cold. First, I found a brand new will. It was dated just 2 weeks after his stroke. His signature on it was shaky, barely legible. In it, my father left 100% of his multi-million-dollar manufacturing company, the estate, and all his liquid assets entirely to Susan. I was left with a patronizing $10,000 for my education. She had coerced a brain-damaged man into signing away my mother's legacy. My vision blurred with rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the house down. But then, I kept digging. I pulled out the company's internal financial ledgers. Not the polished ones they showed to the public, but the raw, unedited shadow books my father kept for himself. As I flipped through the pages, my anger slowly dissolved into absolute shock. The company wasn't an empire anymore. It was a rotting corpse propped up by toothpicks. Following my mother's death, my father had made a series of catastrophic business decisions. He had taken out a massive $8 million balloon loan to cover up a string of failed product launches. And worse, the company's primary manufacturing plant was secretly under investigation by the EPA for illegal chemical dumping. The fines alone were estimated to be in the tens of millions. The company was a ticking time bomb. It was bleeding cash, drowning in debt, and the $8 million balloon payment was due in exactly 14 months. But here was the absolute kicker, the cherry on top of this beautiful disaster. To secure that massive loan, my father had signed a personal guarantee. That means if the company went bankrupt, the bank could legally seize his personal assets. The house, the cars, the life insurance, everything. I sat there on the floor of his study, staring at the paperwork, and a slow, vindictive smile crept across my face. Susan didn't know. She was too obsessed with the country club memberships and the corporate credit card to actually look at the balance sheets. She thought she was stealing a golden goose. She didn't realize she was stealing a hand grenade with the pin already pulled. Right then and there, my grief crystallized into a weapon. I realized that if I fought her for the company, if I contested that fraudulent will in court, the estate would go into probate. The truth about the company's finances would come out, the business would be liquidated, and Susan would likely walk away with the life insurance and the house free and clear. I would be saving her. I couldn't let that happen. If Susan wanted my father's legacy so badly, I was going to give it to her. But I had to make sure she took everything, the title, the equity, and most importantly, the liability. To pull this off, I had to play the role of the desperate, scorned daughter to absolute perfection. I had to fight her just enough so she believed the company was a priceless treasure worth defending. I needed her to be so blinded by greed and the thrill of defeating me that she wouldn't look at the fine print. 3 months later, my father passed away. I won't lie to you, standing at his grave, watching Susan squeeze out crocodile tears from behind a pair of oversized Prada sunglasses, took every ounce of self-control I possessed. She wore a skin-tight black dress. That looked more appropriate for a red carpet than a funeral. She was already mentally spending the money. The very next day, the will was read. When the lawyer announced she was getting the company, Susan turned to me. She didn't even try to hide her smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated malice. "I'm sorry, Maya," she whispered, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Your father just felt I was better equipped to handle his legacy." I immediately launched my trap. I stood up, knocked my chair over, and screamed at her. I called her a gold digger. I told her I would tie her up in court until she was bankrupt. I stormed out of the lawyer's office, making sure she saw genuine tears of rage on my face. The bait was set. Now, I just had to reel her in. I hired a ruthless, loudmouth litigator. We filed an injunction to freeze the estate, contesting the validity of the will. For 6 agonizing months, we dragged Susan through legal hell. We demanded discovery. We deposed her friends. We made her life miserable. And Susan? She took the bait hook, line, and sinker. She hired a team of incredibly expensive corporate defense lawyers, paying them out of her own pocket, draining her personal savings just to fight me for control of the company. She was so obsessed with winning and keeping the multi-million-dollar empire out of my hands that she expressly forbade her lawyers from conducting a deep-dive forensic audit of the company. She told them, "I don't care what it costs, just make sure that spoiled brat doesn't get a single share." She was doing the work for me. She was fighting tooth and nail to claim her own destruction. Which brings us back to that mahogany boardroom table. After 6 months of grueling, expensive litigation, my lawyer reached out to hers with a compromise. I played the part of the exhausted, emotionally drained daughter who just couldn't afford to fight anymore. We called for mediation. I sat across from Susan. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were gleaming with the thrill of victory. My lawyer slid a massive stack of settlement papers across the table. The terms were simple. I would drop the lawsuit. I would walk away from the company entirely. I would even sign a non-disparagement agreement. In exchange, I demanded the $10,000 my father left me, plus an additional $40,000 from Susan's personal account to cover my legal fees. But buried on page 47 of the settlement, hidden beneath layers of dense, suffocating legalese, was the kill shot. By taking full, uncontested ownership of the shares, Susan explicitly agreed to assume all corporate liabilities, indemnifying the estate and personally absorbing any and all personal guarantees attached to the company's outstanding debts. Susan's lawyer skimmed the document. He looked at the bottom line. She gets 100% of the company, and I go away forever. He nodded at her. Sign it, he whispered. She signed her name with a flourish. She handed the pen back to her lawyer, leaned back in her plush leather chair, and gave me that sickening smirk. It's just business, Maya, she said, dripping with condescension. You'll bounce back. I know I will, Susan, I replied, standing up and buttoning my blazer. Good luck with the legacy. I walked out of that building, got into my car, and let out a laugh so loud and unhinged it shook the windows. It was done. The bomb was planted. Now I just had to wait for the timer to hit 0. It took exactly 8 weeks for Susan's world to spontaneously combust. Because Susan was an arrogant narcissist, the first thing she did as the new CEO was fire the company's longtime CFO, the only man who was actively juggling the shadow books and keeping the creditors at bay. With him gone, the plates stopped spinning. First, the EPA dropped the hammer. They concluded their secret investigation and slapped Apex Manufacturing with a $12 million fine for environmental code violations, demanding immediate remediation. The news leaked to the local press. The company's stock plummeted overnight. Susan panicked. She tried to pull money from the company's operating accounts to hire crisis PR, only to discover the accounts were practically empty. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was served 2 weeks later. The bank, spooked by the EPA scandal and the plummeting stock, called in the $8 million balloon loan. They invoked the acceleration clause. They wanted their money, and they wanted it now. Susan tried to file for corporate bankruptcy to protect herself. She thought she could just dissolve the company and walk away to her mansion. But remember page 47 of that settlement she eagerly signed to defeat me? Remember the personal guarantee my father signed? The corporate veil didn't exist for her anymore. She had personally absorbed the blast. My phone started blowing up on a Tuesday. Maya, please pick up. Maya, what is going on with these accounts? Maya, the bank is threatening to take the house! You have to help me. You knew about this. Maya, answer the damn phone. They're freezing my credit cards. I sat on my couch, sipping a glass of expensive red wine, listening to her voicemails play on speakerphone. Her tone shifted from demanding to hysterical to absolutely begging. It was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. I finally texted her back one single line. It's just business, Susan. You'll bounce back. The fallout was biblical. Because she couldn't pay the $8 million loan, the bank executed the personal guarantee. They seized the 6-bedroom estate. They seized her Mercedes G-Wagon. They seized the life insurance payout she had just deposited. They completely liquidated her. But the EPA fines? Those don't just go away in a standard bankruptcy. The federal government placed a lien on every single piece of jewelry, every designer bag, and every future dime she would ever make until the debt was satisfied. In the span of 3 months, Susan went from a millionaire socialite reigning over a stolen empire to a completely bankrupt, legally cornered pariah living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. Her influencer friends abandoned her the second the money dried up. The country club revoked her membership. She fought so hard to steal my father's legacy. She lied, manipulated, and schemed to take everything he had built. And in the end, I let her have exactly what she asked for. Every single penny of his debt. You would think that losing the mansion, the cars, and the bank accounts would be the end of the story. You would think that hitting rock bottom would teach a woman like Susan a lesson in humility. But narcissists don't experience humility. They only experience rage. Susan wasn't going to go down quietly. Like a cornered rat, she lashed out, convinced she could still outsmart me, outlitigate me, and somehow force me to take the financial grenade she had so willingly jumped on. 2 months. After the bank seized the estate, I was served with a massive, desperate lawsuit. Susan had managed to find a bottom-feeding, ambulance-chasing attorney willing to work on contingency. She was suing me for fraudulent concealment, entrapment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. In her delusional mind, because I knew the company was failing and didn't hold her hand and explain it to her like a toddler, I was legally responsible for her ruin. She wanted the court to reverse the settlement, void her personal guarantee, and force me to pay the $12 million EPA fine. When my lawyer called to tell me about the suit, I didn't panic. I laughed. "Let her bring it," I told him. "Let's finish this." We didn't even try to settle. We didn't try to mediate. We pushed for an immediate dismissal with prejudice in front of a judge, and we demanded that Susan be present. I wanted to see her face. I needed to look her in the eyes one last time. The day of the hearing, the contrast was almost poetic. I walked into the courtroom wearing a sharp, tailored suit my mother had bought me years ago. I was calm, collected, and completely at peace. Susan, on the other hand, looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 months. The Botox was wearing off. The designer roots were showing. She was wearing a beige blazer that looked suspiciously like it came off a discount rack, and she was clutching her knockoff handbag like a life preserver. The arrogant, untouchable socialite who had mocked me at the boardroom table was completely gone. In her place was a frantic, shivering shell of a woman. Her lawyer stood up and launched into a theatrical, impassioned speech. He painted Susan as a grieving widow, an innocent victim who had been ruthlessly tricked by a vindictive, jealous stepdaughter. He claimed I had hidden the shadow books, that I had orchestrated a master plan to saddle her with my father's debts. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who looked like she had seen every trick in the book, let him talk for about 10 minutes before she held up a single hand. "Counselor," the judge interrupted, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. "Did your client have legal representation during the settlement mediation?" "Yes, Your Honor, but—" "And did her representation request a forensic audit of Apex Manufacturing during the 6 months of probate litigation?" Susan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Your Honor, my client was under immense emotional distress and—" "I asked a yes or no question, Counselor," the judge snapped. "No, Your Honor, they did not." The judge pulled out the exact transcript from our mediation. She adjusted her glasses and read aloud, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "According to the sworn affidavits from her own previous legal team, your client expressly forbade them from conducting an audit. She stated, and I quote, 'I don't care what it costs, just make sure that spoiled brat doesn't get a single share.' End quote." The judge took off her glasses and glared down at Susan, who was visibly shrinking into her chair. "Mrs. Sterling," the judge said, addressing Susan directly, "you fought tooth and nail to secure total control of this company. You signed a legally binding document that clearly outlined the assumption of liability. You bypassed standard due diligence out of sheer greed and spite. The court is not a babysitter for reckless financial decisions driven by personal vendettas." The judge slammed her gavel down. "Case dismissed with prejudice. And given the utterly frivolous nature of this lawsuit, I am ordering the plaintiff to pay all of the defendant's legal fees. We are adjourned." Susan let out a gasp that sounded like she was physically choking. She grabbed her lawyer's arm, begging him to do something, to file an appeal, to object. But he just shook her off, packed his briefcase, and walked away. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. I stood up, smoothed out my jacket, and walked past her table. Susan looked up at me, her eyes red and brimming with venom. "You planned this," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute hatred. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You destroyed my life." I stopped. I looked down at the woman who had manipulated my sick father, who had isolated him from his only daughter, who had stood over his grave calculating her payout. "No, Susan," I said softly, leaning in so only she could hear. "I didn't destroy your life. I just stepped out of the way and let you destroy it yourself. Enjoy the legacy." That was the last time I ever spoke to Susan, but it wasn't the last time I heard about her. You see, Susan's entire identity was built on the perception of wealth, and when you strip that away from a narcissist, they tend to self-destruct in spectacular public fashion. Desperate for cash and sympathy, Susan took to the internet. She set up a GoFundMe page, claiming she was a victim of corporate fraud and elder abuse. She filmed a 20-minute tear-stained video for TikTok and Instagram, sitting in her drab apartment, crying about how her evil stepdaughter had stolen her future and left her destitute. She thought the internet would rally behind her. She thought her old followers would open their wallets and save her. She forgot that the internet is undefeated when it comes to digging up the truth. It didn't take me releasing anything. The EPA investigation was public record. The bankruptcy filings were public record. Within 48 hours, true crime creators and drama channels got hold of her video. They pulled the court documents. They pulled the environmental fines. They exposed the fact that she had personally fired the CFO, accelerating the company's collapse. The backlash was biblical. Her comments sections turned into a war zone. People ripped her apart for crying about a designer lifestyle, while the company she demanded to own was literally poisoning local groundwater. The hashtag #ToxicStepmom started trending. Within a week, GoFundMe shut down her campaign, citing a violation of their terms of service against raising money to pay off government fines and legal penalties. She didn't get a dime. She only got humiliated on a global scale. Eventually, she deleted all her social media accounts, fading into complete obscurity, buried under a mountain of unpayable debt that will follow her for the rest of her natural life. But while Susan was busy drowning in the grave she dug for herself, I was busy building. Remember the $50,000 I walked away with from our mediation? The $10,000 from my dad, and the $40,000 Susan paid me from her own pocket? I didn't just put that in a savings account. When Apex Manufacturing was officially liquidated in federal bankruptcy court, all of its assets were auctioned off to pay the bank. The factories, the machinery, the office, furniture, it all went to the highest bidders. But I knew a secret about the company. A secret my mother had shared with me years ago. The physical company was worthless, but buried in their intellectual property portfolio was a single, dormant patent. It was a revolutionary, eco-friendly manufacturing process my mother had designed and patented a decade ago. My father never implemented it because it was too expensive to retool the factories. At the bankruptcy auction, the corporate vultures were fighting over the real estate and the heavy machinery. No one cared about a dusty, unused patent. I bought my mother's patent at that auction for exactly $35,000. Using the remaining $15,000, I hired a brilliant startup consultant. I took my mother's brilliant, eco-friendly design to a group of green tech venture capitalists. I showed them the math. I showed them the future. They loved it. Today, 3 years after that nightmare began, I am the CEO of my own manufacturing firm. We don't dump chemicals. We don't rely on toxic shadow books. We are clean, we are profitable, and we are growing every single day. I didn't just take back my father's stolen empire. I let it burn to the ground. And from the ashes, I built the empire my mother actually deserved. So, what's the takeaway here? If there is a Susan in your life, a toxic, greedy, manipulative force trying to push you out and take what's yours, do not panic. Do not let them see you sweat. People blinded by greed are the easiest people in the world to defeat, because they will always, always overplay their hand. They are so focused on the shiny object, so obsessed with winning the prize, that they never bother to check if the prize is actually a trap. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't fighting back. It isn't screaming or plotting or tearing them down. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply smiling, stepping aside, and giving them exactly what they want. Because if you wait long enough, the trash will always take itself out. Stay sharp, stay ruthless, and I'll see you in the next one.